Well, guys, I'm excited tonight to continue our study, through the Word, obviously, with this particular series we have called Heroes of Faith. We could say, that these heroes of faith that we're going to be looking at, and we have looked at, not only ran well, but the important thing with all this is finishing well. It's one thing to run a race. It's another thing to finish the race, right? You run as hard as you want to run. If you don't finish well, what's the whole purpose of the thing? And unfortunately, there's recorded in the Word those that ran well a good part of their lives, but in the end, they didn't finish so good. And a couple of those I just want to mention to you guys. A couple of those is, guys remember in the Old Testament, Jehoshaphat, son of Asa. In fact, Asa was basically in the same camp as this. He reigned 25 years in his godly ways, yet he failed by partnering up with ungodly people, just got around the wrong crowds. Another guy is Amaziah. 29 years, ran well, and basically later on in life failed by worshiping other gods and dealing in his life with pride issues. All things that we really go through. Another one is King Saul. We're all familiar with King Saul. Despite being chosen by Samuel, under God's direction, as the first king of Israel, later in life, he allowed disobedience, he allowed pride, he allowed bad choices to really consume him. And it was just a sad thing. And I'm sure, tonight, all of us know somebody that could be added to the list, right? I know I do. In fact, one that I just want to mention to you guys that I thought about as I was putting this study together is a great buddy. A few years ago, actually, I ran into this guy that I hadn't seen probably in like 40 years. Been a long time. A guy that, we went to high school together. We were best buddies together. We rode motorcycles together, involved in ministry together. In fact, in the mid to late 70s, we were both involved down at Calvary Chapel, San Diego at the time when the Lord was just doing an incredible thing down there through Mike McIntosh and all. It had kind of, bled over the Jesus movement from Costa Mesa had kind of come down this way and down at the North Park Theater down in San Diego, in North Park there, the Lord was doing crazy things. On Wednesday nights, every week, hundreds of people were getting saved. It was just insane. And my buddy and I were part of just the ministry there, helping people and loving on people and serving people. Well, so he calls me, and I'm on the phone with him, again, 40 years since I've seen this guy. And after about 2 minutes of talking to him and probably 5 or 6 F-bombs, I'm thinking, man, this guy, our conversation isn't going so well, and this guy definitely isn't walking with the Lord the way he used to. And I'm kind of thinking this in the back of my mind, and he definitely wasn't on the path of finishing well. He just wasn't doing good. So the good thing is, which was just kind of cool with him, is about every 5 or 6 weeks in the last, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 months, we've been talking on the phone. Now he knows what I do. And all, he doesn't do the F-bomb things anymore, kind of catches himself for whatever reason. But the point is unfortunately, he started well, he ran well for a long time, but right now he's just not in the point of looking like he's going to finish that race that God set before him. Kind of a sad thing, in fact. So, the important thing, again, guys, as we talk about this point is good starts are important, but it's the finish that counts, right? Yeah, I know there's a few guys here tonight. I saw Tim and I saw Dave, you out there, guys that follow Supercross and motocross, and maybe some of your other ones that have either ride now or used to ride. Know the importance of the starts. Starts are important, but I'll tell you what's more important than a start. What's more important is being consistent. What's more important about pacing yourselves, and obviously crossing the finish line first is the one that receives the prize, right? The guy gets across the line first. In that particular sport, we call it gets on the box, basically. And so, we also have just experienced, you guys know, a few months ago, the Olympics, another great example. I don't care how well you start, the medals are only awarded to those that finish well. The gold, the silver, the bronze. If you don't get one of those when the athlete goes home, he's not very happy. Nothing in his hands. So kind of a sad thing there. So just an example of what that looks like. But tonight, we're going to look at the life of a real hero of faith, this guy named Moses. And we're very familiar with this guy for sure. Someone definitely has his flaws for sure, but finished the task that God had put before him well. if the number of times that Moses is mentioned in the Bible is any gauge of his popularity, this dude wins the prize. His name, and I didn't count this, so if you guys want to fact check, you can do this yourself. But a couple of sources I read say this guy's name is mentioned over 700 times in the Word. And I couldn't help but think that when Sean was doing the study on Enoch, I'm thinking, here's Moses with 700 times in the Bible. Enoch, I think there's like 3 sentences in the whole Bible about this guy. And so Moses, the word is loaded with this guy's name. He's all over the place. His name means, guys, taken out or drawn forth. And you guys remember the story. The new Pharaoh had come on the scene that didn't know Joseph, and, he gets this bright idea to use Joseph's relatives, the Hebrew people there, as a bunch of slaves. And gets to the point that, becomes afraid of this growing Hebrew population, which was getting huge, thinking that they were going to revolt against him and take over his rule in Egypt. He ordered all the newborn Hebrew babies, as you guys know the story, to be destroyed. But what did he do with them? Throw them in the Nile River, right? And so Moses' mom, catches on to this, and her name Jochebed, and sets up Moses with this cool little basket, kind of little mini ark, with the hope, obviously, of sparing his life. She floats him down the river, puts him in the Nile River by some brush and all there. And just by chance, obviously this is a God thing, but Pharaoh's daughter is down by the river's edge taking a bath, sees the basket, has one of her handmaidens come over and check it out. And here's this little Hebrew boy laying in there. And she not only saves Moses' life, but goes on to raise him, as we're told in the scriptures, in all the ways of Egypt as her son. It's just really interesting as we think about that as baby Moses was drawn out of the water, that later in life he would draw out God's people from the land of Egypt. His name is perfect, what he's going to be doing here in the future. It's really cool. But before we get into our text, I have a question to ask you guys. When I mention Moses to you, what do you think of? What are some things that we know about this guy? What are some things we know about this guy, guys? Anybody? Yeah. He's a leader, great leader. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. How about something else about Moses' life? Yeah, he was, yeah. Yeah, didn't go so good there. He what? Anger issues, absolutely. He had anger issues.
He was afraid to go to Pharaoh because he thought he had a lisp or something.
Yeah, yeah. And yet being brought up in the ways of Egypt, yeah, we know later, and we're going to find that later on, that the scripture deals with that. Yeah, yeah. Dave? Fearful, yeah. Yeah. How about some of the things he did, things he was exposed to? Like, how about I think about this thing like the burning bush kind of a thing, kind of an interesting thing, right? The burning bush, you just see, smoking and it's not consuming at all. Kind of a cool thing. But some other things. Yeah. All the time, right? Yes, all the time. Yeah, Angel?
He wants to see God's glory through the rock.
Yes. Crazy, huh? What a thing that must have been for him. Amazing. Amazing, amazing. Yeah, yeah. So a couple of things I thought about. Again, the burning bush, and then again, talking to this bush, that will not burn up. And I was thinking, too, of Moses. I can just picture him standing before the most powerful man in the world at that time, representing God by saying, "Let my people go," and taking a stand in that way before Pharaoh there. How about coming off, this is a cool one, off Mount Sinai, with his face glowing. It's funny how I get these pictures in my brain, but I think about him having this level or blind on his face, maybe going over like Aaron. It's kind of like, now you see me, now you don't. He was glowing, so the glow would come out, he turned the glow off and on and all, but his face was glowing coming on the mountain. Because he experienced God's glory, and so his face is glowing with that. Another thing, remember the battle with the Amalekites. Remember Moses up on the hill, and he gets tired, so he sits on the rock and staff in hand, and Aaron and Ur kind of hold up his arms, hold up his hands. When his hands go up, the boys are down there. Joshua and the boys are down on the battlefield, and every time Moses raises his hands up, the enemy's pushed back. Every time he lowers his hands, the enemy comes against as their foes again. So that's kind of a cool thing. How about the Red Sea? How big is that, man? Think about that for a minute. Parting the Red Sea so the children of Israel could pass through on dry ground, and then seeing it just come back and wipe out this huge Egyptian army. I mean, this guy was awesome. He was exposed to some crazy stuff. In fact, many believe that Moses is one of the greatest men that ever lived. That's recorded in history. Kind of cool. He was a great man, guys, used in a great way by a God he loved, but he definitely had his issues. There were issues there. And, I love that because, the Bible records the good, the bad, and the ugly about people, doesn't it? I mean, I'm glad it does that, which, by the way. In Moses' case, I think it was Patrick mentioned back there, one of his biggies was anger. A couple different situations. Remember in the story, he killed the Egyptian taskmaster in anger. He broke the first set of the Ten Commandments, coming down the hill. Beat the rock with his staff for water, misrepresenting God to the people. So these are some things that were all kind of driven by anger there. So, those are obviously things that we saw Moses doing. But thank the Lord that he uses, as he did then and he does today, he uses imperfect people, guys, to do his perfect will. And that gives us hope, right? Man, I'm glad that does, man, because it gives us all hope in this room tonight. And we know by Scripture that he was a very humble guy. In fact, in Numbers 12:3, it's recorded that it says this, it says, "Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men that were on the face of the earth." So this guy was gifted with humility. I've heard it said that true humility is finding your confidence in God rather than in yourself. And I think that's a good definition of that. We're also told in Exodus 33:11, it says, and this is another huge thing, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks with his friend. How big is that? Crazy there, huh? This guy was also a prayer warrior. The Bible records him 3 different times praying for 40 days and 40 nights. And there's no record during that time. It seems as though he was fasting during that time too, because it doesn't talk about him, eating or anything there. Just a crazy prayer warrior too. And obviously that's a supernatural thing. He's also, as we know, a part of the great cloud of witnesses that we see noted as we've been studying Hebrews chapter 11 for sure, where it notes these heroes of faith that these men and women who live for God with all their hearts, not perfect by any means, but faithful to God and the God that they love and that they serve. Just an amazing thing. They prove by their lives, guys, that it pays to live the faith life. And I would say Moses lived the faith life instead of the self life, to live in dependence upon God instead of dependence upon self. They practiced that principle of walking by faith and not by sight that we see in 2 Corinthians 2:7 for sure. So, question for you guys. How many of you guys have seen that Cecil DeMille movie? I think it's a 1956 or 57 old movie, The Ten Commandments. You guys see that thing? I was thinking about Mark when about, 2 months or so ago, Janine and I, we were home and just kind of sitting there and said, hey, let's check out the Ten Commandments. So we got, I think it was on Amazon Prime or something. And so we clicked it on, and anyway, the special effects in this thing are just absolutely hilarious. I was thinking about where we've gone compared to 56 compared to now, like with the burning bush scene. You guys got to see it yourself just to kind of check it out. It reminds me, remember those old Japanese Godzilla movies where it showed that, the boat and Godzilla's going, it's in a bathtub, man, but that's like Godzilla's attacking this thing. Anyway, the point being that the special effects weren't the best in the world, but the story was beautiful in this. Charlton Heston played a great part, and the movie basically portrays Moses, being the deliverer of God's people, from the slavery of Egypt. We know that. And another thing, we think about Moses, this guy, he wore a bunch of hats, a lot of big hats, man. He was the lawgiver. He was the one that God chose to deliver the people from slavery. He was the one that basically, records the history of the nation Israel just throughout the chapters at the beginning of the Bible there. It's amazing. And again, we know God used Moses to write the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch, or the 5 scrolls we call it, or we've have it called the Torah or the Law. So the guy, was involved in a lot of different things. So tonight, let's take a few minutes and see what made this Hebrew slave a mighty man of faith that finished strong. So Moses' life, guys, could be broken down into 3 parts, each 40 years long. D.L. Moody said this about Moses. He said, Moses spent his first 40 years thinking he was a somebody, spent his second 40 years learning what it means to be a nobody, and spent his final 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. That's kind of the span of Joseph's bio there, his life. So part 1, let's look at that first. The first 40 years, basically as a son of an Egyptian pharaoh. That was his part at that moment in his life. He was raised a prince in Egypt. We know that. He belonged to the same family that ruled the world's greatest empire at the time. This guy, he was big man on campus, man. He was definitely living the life of the rich and famous. And his lifestyle reflected, obviously, all the riches of Egypt, had access to all the resources that were part of the Egypt culture. I think about, it's like you look at in the military, that Top Gun, person that's going to be flying these crazy jets that are up there flying in the air. These are like the 1 or 2% people that are chosen from all the other guys. This is what Moses was. He was at the top of the rung, top of the barrel. The Lamborghini chariot, I'm sure. I got at the end, it probably say something like Moses 1 on it, and a nice little Lamborghini chariot running around out there. And as we know, he was probably being groomed at the time to be the next king of Egypt. That was he was being groomed for. In fact, in Acts 7:22, we're told that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Remember that later on. He was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deed. So that's kind of part one. Part two, or his second 40 years, here we see him as a shepherd out in the wilderness with the animals. And that's a place, for an Egyptian, a shepherd is about as low as you can go on the scale of importance. They were kind of despised. Moses went from the lifestyle of the Egyptian prince to that of a simple shepherd. The Egyptian culture, a shepherd was considered basically an abomination. An abomination is a thing that causes disgust or hatred. So that's kind of where he's relating to, where he has chosen to go at this time. And you guys know the story, right? He killed the Egyptian taskmaster and became a fugitive on the run, and he had to head out, or obviously that was going to be dealt with. One Bible commentator I love this said this about Moses. He said, instead of leading an army with all its pomp, he was leading a flock of sheep with all their poop. So he's out there with the sheep doing his thing. He traded in his sword for a pooper scooper is pretty what it boils down to. So he's out there in the wilderness and all. So I kind of picture, I get these crazy things in my brain. Old Mo with his staff in one hand and his pooper scooper in the other, out there in the wilderness and just kind of, getting lessons, learning lessons from God. It must have been an awful, humbling time, I could imagine, with this guy's background and all. But God used this guy at this time in a special way, really. Moses learned at this time to be loving. He learned to be caring. And most importantly, humble before the sight of God. And in the big picture here, God was developing a true shepherd's heart in this guy's life. It's a beautiful thing. And again, lots of life lessons out there in the old sheepfold. No doubt about it. God was teaching him lots of lessons. If you haven't read the book, A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 33 by Philip Keller, he actually used to be a shepherd. Definitely pick it up. It's a great read. It talks about the life of a shepherd and what that all looks like. It's really, really cool. Great analogies in it. So I have another question. How many times in life can we all look back at something and think, God, how can you use this for good? I mean, you look at where Moses was, where Moses is, and in the big picture, you look at Lord, what are you doing here? How can this be used for any good? Well, we have the answer in the Word. It's awesome. In Ephesians 3:20 says this. It says, now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, unto him be glory in the church by Jesus Christ to all generations forever and ever. So that principle of him doing exceedingly abundantly above anything we ever think, and obviously Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good for those that love God and are called according to his purpose. It reminds us that God can use times in our lives that seem like such a waste for great things to be used later on. I share the story of our great brother, Mike Faveros, all the time with people, with the guys I meet with. Mike's story, prison for lots of years, gangbanger, drug seller, all these things. And the guy now is being used by the Lord in such a beautiful way in our Spanish community. So he has a heart of gold. But God used those crummy years of his life to prepare him for what he's doing in his life today. It's just such a beautiful thing to see. So part 3, the last 40 years. So this is all preparation to get Moses to this last part of his life, the last 40 years. As a leader of Israel, he's now ready to be used by God to his full potential. So all those life lessons, guys, that had prepared Moses at that time for exactly what God now has in store for him next. The writer of the book of Hebrews describes Moses' remarkable life in 5 two-word statements seen in chapter 11. So go ahead and turn to Hebrews chapter 11, guys. We're going to read together verses 23 through 29. So again, we're looking for a two-word statement that we see noted here, looking at what the secret in Moses' life was. So it says in 23, it says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. He looked to the reward. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempted to do so and were drowned. Anyone figure out what the two words are? By faith, yeah, you guys got it. A+. So by faith. I love the acronym for this word faith. And the acronym that I love goes this way. It says, forwarding all issues to heaven. F-A-I-T-H, forwarding all issues to heaven. There was a couple that went to our church some years ago. Their names were Ashley and Andy. Rob, do you remember what their last names were? I was trying to think of it. It was kind of a different last. Anyway, really, really neat couple. And this couple, Andy was one that shouldn't have even been alive. He had a bad accident, and he was a miracle just in and of himself. Told them they'd never have kids. I think they ended up having 3 kids. And anyway, just God had blessed these guys amazingly. But Andy was the acronym master. He was master of it. Jeannie and I would see Andy over at Target, where he was a cashier over in Vista here. And we would see him or wave or stop by and say hi. And without fail, he would say something like this. He'd say, Pastor Steve, he'd go on and say, Bible, B-I-B-L-E, basic instructions before leaving earth. And we would just kind of smile at each other and walk by. Or he'd say something like this. Next, he'd go something like, the joy of the Lord is my strength. And he'd go, joy, J-O-Y. And he'd go, Jesus, others, yourself. And so these incredible acronyms, but the one on faith is the one I love most, and that's where I got that from. He would say, as believers, we should walk by faith and not by sight. And old Andy would go, faith, F-A-I-T-H, again, forwarding all issues to heaven. So this dude, it was really, really kind of cool family. But faith is defined, guys, this way. It's defined as complete trust or confidence in something or someone. Complete trust or confidence in something or someone. Hebrews 11, 1 through 3, in the New Living Translation says this. It says, faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. In faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, and what we now see did not come from anything that has been seen or can be seen. Awesome. So I asked the question again, how did Moses complete the task set before him? So we know, by faith. He did it by faith. Again, we're told in the Word to walk by faith and not by sight. We're also told that faith comes by hearing, right? And hearing by the beautiful works of the Word of God. It's beautiful. It takes us right back to the Word. So here in Hebrews, guys, we see at least 4 great life lessons on the subject of faith that mark the life of Moses. I'd like to go through these together. Life lesson 1, Moses' life was marked with fearless, faithful courage. Fearless, faithful courage. Verse 27 there in Hebrews tells us, by faith he forsook or he left Egypt. It says, Hebrews 11:27 reads this way. It says, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. He was willing to give up the whole Egyptian lifestyle and align himself with Hebrew slaves, which basically could have cost him his life at the time. So this is radical what's going on here. Talk about, fearless, faithful courage. Crazy. Missionary Jim Elliot once said this, guys. He said, wherever you are, be all there. In other words, be all in. Be all in. I don't think there's anything worse than a lukewarm believer. Kind of lukewarm with 1 foot in and 1 foot out. Jesus even gives a stern warning about this in the lukewarm camp. He says this in Revelation 3:15 through 16. He says, I know your works, that you are neither hot or cold. I wish you were either hot or cold. So then, because you are lukewarm and neither hot or cold, I will vomit you out of my mouth. And so, guys, encouragement here is don't be one that straddles the fence. Moses was not one that straddled the fence. I heard Greg Laurie call this type of person a mugwump. and a mugwump is one that has his mug on one side and his wump on the other. He's riding the fence, riding the rail on the top of the fence, and that's just a dangerous place to be. So Moses, as he left Egypt this first time, he burned every bridge behind him. He left the palace never to go back to his old life, and that's the key, never going back to his old life. And not only, did Moses leave once, we sometimes forget that he left twice. He was, his first 40 years, when he killed the Egyptian taskmaster, he got out of town really fast, going into the wilderness, a defeated man. He was defeated at that time. But 40 years later, at age 80, second part there, he left with fearless courage. First time he left fearing the Pharaoh. This time he left, we're told in the word, not fearing the wrath of the king from verse 27. So Mo here is Mr. Boldness. He's in boldness in the spirit of God, obviously, not in his flesh. He not only goes on to face the Pharaoh one time, but we know what happens with all the plagues. He faces him 9 times. You guys know the story again as I talk about, let my people go. Let my people go, and the plagues come. Let my people go. So over and over and over, he's facing Pharaoh with this. In Exodus 10, 28 and 29, it says this. It says, after the 9th plague of darkness on the land, the Pharaoh says to Moses, get away from me. Take heed to yourself and see my face no more. For in that day you see my face, you shall die. So Moses said, you have spoken well. I will never see your face again. He never at that time does, for sure. I found this great quote talking about faith and all. It says, true, fearless faith is marked by great courage to do the will of God. The fear of man is overcome by fearing God. That's the trick of that. The fear of man, guys, is one of Satan's most effective snares. We see that in Proverbs 29:25. He says, the fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord will be safe. That's where our safety is, in the Lord. It's so true. Warren Wiersbe says this. He says, true faith causes a believer to hold the right values and to make the right decisions. Really cool. So lesson learned there. You want to finish strong, guys? Fill your life with fearless, faithful courage. So life lesson number 2. Moses' life was marked with faithful spiritual eyesight. In verse 27, it tells us, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So who did Moses keep his eyes upon? Obviously, God himself. Moses kept his eyes on God. It reminds us today to always look up before looking out. It's always best, guys, to filter the issues of life through the lens of God's eyes, isn't it? So we look up at the Lord, and then we look vertical before we look horizontal. Great principle for us today. And where, again, did he find his strength? By faith, he focused upon God. There's a great story in Matthew chapter 14. You guys know this story already, or I've read it many times. Where the disciples were caught in a giant storm. And there, they saw Jesus walking on the water, thinking, that he was a ghost. And obviously, they cried out in fear as they're out there on the water. And after Jesus identified himself in that story there, Peter asked Jesus if he could come out of the boat and, go walk on the water, go hang out with him. And so Jesus says, come on down, Peter. And so Peter jumps out the boat, walks on the water toward Jesus, until he gets distracted, guys, right? By the waves and by the wind and all. And guess what happens? Takes his eyes off the Lord and gets stuck on these other things, and he starts to sink. But praise God that Jesus stretches out his hand and saves Peter from sinking. So the life lesson I believe we have here is, as long as you keep your eyes on Jesus, no matter what storm you are in, you'll be safe in his hands. I love that. Be safe in his hands. Remember the old, I don't know if they have this logo anymore, but it was Allstate. Remember, they would do I think they had a thing like this. Guy would hold out his hands and says, you're in good hands with Allstate. I just love the picture of thinking we're in good hands with Jesus, man. He's got us. He's wrapped his arms around us and protecting us in that way. Kind of a cool thing. So that's life lesson number 2. And again, with that said, Moses faced many storms in life, but his God, guys, was always bigger than any storm. There's an amazing book that Max Lucado wrote that I love, and it's called Facing Your Giants. If you guys haven't read this book, it's an awesome read. And I love one of the quotes that went like this. It says, focus on giants you stumble, focus on God and your giants tumble. It's a great quote. So the question is not, how big are your giants? The question should be, how big is your God? How big is your God? As we're dealing with different situations in life, for sure. So life lesson 1, fearless, faithful courage. Life lesson 2, faithful spiritual eyesight. Life lesson 3 now is Moses' life was marked with faithful obedience. And we see this in verse 28. It says, by faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood. By faith, he kept the Passover. The word kept signifies continual action. In other words, Moses kept on keeping the Passover. He kept it up. Why? Obviously, to keep the angel of death away. And we know the story. Moses takes the lamb, kills it, places the blood on the header and the jamb of the door opening. Angel of death comes through, saw the blood, he passed by, right? So the lesson learned there, he was obedient to God's direction, and only the blood of the Passover lamb saved them from eternal death. And who is that Passover lamb for us today? Jesus, right? Jesus is the one that washes away our sin. We're protected in his blood. So faithful, fearless courage, faithful spiritual eyesight, faithful obedience, and fourthly, Moses' life was marked with faithful commitment. Verse 29, it says, by faith, they passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. This is a great story. We got to read this together. Turn, guys, to Exodus 14 real quick. Exodus 14. Starting in verse 15. Exodus 14:15. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward, but lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I will indeed harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over his army, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. And the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of the cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of the Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near and the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on the right hand, on the left. And the Egyptian pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and all his horsemen. Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar and the fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians, and check it out, he took off their chariot wheels, so they drove them with difficulty. Man, got a spiritual lug wrench, man, and taken the wheels off, and he took off their chariot wheels, so they drove with difficulty, and the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, and the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots and on their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing onto it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh, and came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right and on their left hand. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead at the seashore. Thus, Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. So Moses' faith here, guys, was contagious. Here's these guys trapped by the mountains on one side. The Red Sea is in front of them. Behind them, here comes Pharaoh and his army. But Moses did not waver. In Exodus 14:13, a couple verses before the ones we just read, and Moses says this, he says, do not fear. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. This is a leader, man. This dude is leading and doing his part in such a great way there. So God sends the wind, the waters parted, and with faithful commitment, Moses moves forward. He goes forward. He believed God would make a way when there seemed no way possible, but God did. And, again, Moses was a great hero of faith. His faith was marked once again with faithful, fearless courage, faithful spiritual eyesight, faithful obedience, and faithful commitment. I've heard it said that Moses chose the imperishable, saw the invisible, and did the impossible. I like that. Chose the imperishable, saw the invisible, and did the impossible. You know, God is in the business of using ordinary people who are flawed to do extraordinary things in and through them for his glory. And we see that happening in the life of his servant Moses. It's so cool to see that. And nothing's changed in the Lord's eyes for us today in that same way. You know, Moses murders an Egyptian taskmaster. He's rejected by his countrymen, flees Egypt for his life, lives on the backside of the desert learning life lessons for the next 40 years, comes back to Egypt to deliver the people from slavery. And before he turns the baton over to Joshua, guess what? He leads them to the border of the promise, which was God's call in his life. Get him to the border. That's what he called him to do. And you know, guys, all the humps and bumps, the tests and trials in life made him the man he was. You know, perfect by no means, but faithful to the call God put on his life. What's really interesting here is how Moses started out his call to ministry basically telling God he had the wrong guy. Did you guys ever pick that up before? He basically is telling the Lord, you don't have the right guy here. Check it out. Exodus 3:11 says this, and this is Moses speaking to the Lord. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out to Egypt? And God's calling him to this work, and Moses is coming up with these excuses. Exodus 4:1 says, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord has not appeared to you. You know, the fear thing going on. And this is a real great one. Exodus 4:10, it says, oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before you or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Really? In Acts 7:22, we're told Moses was taught in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in both speech and action. And this is just amazing what fear can do, huh? Fear can just shut you down. Fear can be such a deception in your life. So another thing I never caught before, guys, an amazing thing in the life of Moses that I really never paid much attention to is this. I want to check out the contrast between Numbers, a section in Numbers 11 and Exodus 32. In Numbers 11, 10 through 15, the scene basically here is the people complaining to Moses. Now, I can just read this to you guys. It's Numbers 11, 10 through 15. And again, the people are complaining. It goes this way. It says, so the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything they said. Then the Lord anger blazed against them, and he set a fire to rage among them, and he destroyed some of the people in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people screamed to Moses for help, and when he prayed to the Lord, the fire stopped. After that, the area was known as Taberah, which means the place of burning, because fire from the Lord had burned among there. Thus, the foreign rabble, which are the mixed multitude, who were traveling with the Israelis, began to crave the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain. Oh, for some meats, they explained. We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. All we had all the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic we wanted, but now our appetites are gone. All we ever see is manna. All we're getting is manna. You know, the manna burgers, manna pancakes, manicotti, all the different manna we're making, right? And it says the manna looked like small coriander seed. It was pale yellow like gum resin. The people would go out and gather it on the ground. We know the story. They made flour by grinding it with hand mills or pounding it in mortars. Then they boiled it in pots and made it flat cakes. After 40 years, they figured out a lot of stuff to do with this stuff. And then the cakes tasted like pastries baked with olive oil. The manna came down on the camp with the dew during the night. So Moses heard all the family standing in the doorways of their tents, whining, and the Lord became extremely angry. So Moses was also very aggravated. And Moses says to the Lord, why are you treating me, your servant, so harshly? Have mercy on me. What did I do to deserve the burden of all these people? Did I give birth to them? Did I bring them into the world? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms like a mother carries a nursing baby? How can I carry them to the land you swore to give their ancestors? Where am I supposed to get meat for all these people? They keep whining to me, saying, give me meat to eat. I can't carry all these people by myself. The load is far too heavy. If this is how you intend to treat me, just go ahead and kill me. Do me a favor and spare my misery. Check it out. I mean, he's really crazy at this point. But check it out now, that Numbers 11 versus Exodus 32, a little different scene now. And the scene here, guys, is right after the golden calf fiasco. So the Lord says to Moses, I've seen the people, indeed they are a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, and my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make you a great nation. So basically, the Lord wanted to smoke these people and start all over at this time. But check out what Moses did. He goes and he says, he pleads with the Lord, he pleads with him not to turn the people basically into crispy critters. Verse 14 tells us, so the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. Crazy. I mean, notice Moses' heart here in 30 to 32 out of Exodus. And it says this, it says, now it came to pass on the next day that Moses says to the people, you have committed a great sin. So now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, oh, these people have committed a great sin and have made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, check this out. I pray, blot me out of the book which you have written. Blot my name out of the book you have written. So Moses' guys' hearts go from, Lord, the load's too far, the load is too heavy for me. Just kill me, spare the misery. To, if you will not forgive their sin, take my life eternally for theirs. How crazy is that? What a change of heart between those two stories. You know, I wonder sometimes that these people really realize how many times that old Moses saved these guys' butts. But this time, definitely saved it here. So his heart totally changes. And what an example of a godly leader that has an other-centered heart that's willing to give his life eternally for the people that he called to lead. Amazing. You know, these years or those years of wandering in the wilderness, again, all these life lessons that grew Moses, just took his heart and turned it into a special man of God. And so I ask the question, guys, are you willing to be faithful with the call that God has put upon your lives? You know, are you willing, as Moses was, to exercise faithful courage, eyesight, obedience, and commitment in your service to the Lord? You know, I love the people God has put around you. Or you think about this, to love the people that God has put around you in an unconditional way. That's what Moses is doing now. You know, Moses came across the finish line well. And, you know, right now, you know, there might be some of you guys that might be in the middle of something really crazy in your lives, man. Just something nuts going on. I just encourage you. God has a perfect plan in store for your life. And his heart is, as it was with Moses, to see you, as he did him, finish well. Romans 8:31 says, and I love the scripture, if God is for us, who can be against us? What a beautiful promise that we have. And I love also what we're told in Philippians 1:6. He says, he that has begun a good work in you will be faithful to complete it into the day of Jesus Christ. So Deuteronomy, guys, 34 goes on and records Moses' final days. Closes them out here. It says this. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the lands of Judah, as far as the Mediterranean Sea, then the Negev, the whole region of the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, this is the land I promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him as they did to the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, who the Lord knew face to face, nor did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt to Pharaoh and to all the officials and to the whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in all the sight of Israel, man. This guy finished well. He finished the race well. Exodus 40:16 tells us, thus Moses did according to all the Lord had commanded, so he did. Exodus 40:33 continues on and says, so Moses finished the work, guys. He finished the work. So Faithfully, we are to trust the Lord. We should be trusting and obeying the Lord, guys. The call he puts on our life. And let's finish the work he has entrusted to us together. Amen? That's our job. Let's finish the work, man. Finish the work because God is faithful. So, a little bit of time we have left. This is what I'd like to do. Exodus 33:11 tells us this. It says, "So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend." Think about that for a minute. Spoke to Moses face to face as the man speaks to his friend. Verse 9 and 10 in the same section says, "And it came to pass when Moses entered the tabernacle that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked with Moses there. And the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose and worshiped each man at his tent door." So one and one is his tent door. And I can't help, guys, but wonder what the conversation would have been like between God and Moses. You ever think about that? I think about 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain with God. I mean, do you do your devos in the morning with God? I don't know what that looks like, but the conversations must have been awesome. It must have been just this crazy. The idea of God speaking to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend just blows my mind. But I believe God would have us tonight, guys, spend some one-on-one time talking with him at the doors of our hearts. Talking with him at the doors of our hearts. Some one-on-one time in that posture of worship with him. In Psalm 100, 4 and 5, it says this. It says, "Enter into his gates with thanksgiving and into his courts with praise. Be thankful to him and bless his name. For the Lord is good, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth endures to all generations." There's a song that a group called Undercover. Do you guys anybody remember Undercover? It goes back a little bit. The old Maranatha, I know Rob would. Undercover. Anyway, this group came, it was like late 70s, early 80s. And they wrote a song called "Talk to God." And it was so crazy. I was looking up the other day some things on actually some RV stuff on YouTube. And all of a sudden, it clicks on a little box for whatever reason on some love song stuff. The group Love Song. I said, "What? Love Song?" So I clicked on Love Song, and it was kind of going down the trail and seeing some different groups and things we were talking about. I saw this group Undercover. I remember those guys. And so I clicked on it, and I saw this title, "Talk to God." And I thought, I remember that song. And so I recorded the words to this because I believe these lyrics will help us right now prepare our hearts for some one-on-one time with the Lord. Check out these lyrics. It goes this way. Again, the title of the song is "Talk to God." It says, "I need something I can sink my teeth into. I'm not a strong man. I need God's love to see me through. Are you listening? Are you listening? He's a God of love, and he wants to hear from you, so pray. Talk to God. Let's talk to God before the night is through. Talk to God. Let's talk to God before the night is through. Are you hungry? Do you feel like the walking dead? Do you want another chance, or do you like the pain inside your head? Are you listening? Are you listening? He's a God of love, and he wants to hear from you, so pray. Talk to God. Let's talk to God before the night is through. Talk to God. Let's talk to God before the night is through. Talk to God. Talk to God. Let's talk to God. Talk to God. Let us talk to God before the night is through. So guys, he wants to hear from you. That's the lesson. He wants to hear from you.